I'll give you all my cattle. Just make me a mother," whispered the abandoned wife in Wild West Stories. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Out on the ragged edge of dry willow, a woman once whispered to the wind, "I'll give you all my cattle. Just make me a mother." From that hush began a tale of silence and storm, of strangers who became kin, of kindness sown in hard ground. Stay with me. This Western will slow your breath and maybe mend a piece of your own. She offered the wind all her cattle, if only it would make her a mother. Before dawn had even thought of breaking, the sky in the east carried a pale smear the color of ashes. Wind came off the open range, dry and restless, carrying dust and the faint animal smell of cattle. It pressed through the seams of the small ranch house on the edge of dry willow, sighing against warped boards as if the land itself were weary. Eliza Hart rose before the rooster, same as she always had. She coaxed a flame out of the kindling left from the night before, the fire sputtering like an old man clearing his throat before it finally caught. The coffee pot hissed slow on the iron stove, each drip landing with the patience of a clock that no longer rushed anyone. On the table sat two bowls, one she used every day, its rim chipped, its surface worn smooth by years of washing. The other was a plain wooden bowl she'd carved herself long ago. She set it down across from her own place, slid a spoon into it, and straightened the cloth beneath as if someone might soon sit there. For a moment she stood, hand lingering over the table's scarred wood, eyes unfocused. Then she lifted the empty bowl and returned it to the shelf. The silence in the room didn't break, it simply deepened. Outside, the pasture rolled away in shades of dun and gray, the thin line of the creek barely glinting where the sun might someday find it. A cow lowed with the tired voice of age. Eliza pulled her coat close, buttoned at the throat, and stepped down into the yard. Dust clung to the hem of her skirt. Her boots rang a muted rhythm on the porch boards, the kind of sound a body only hears when the world is otherwise still. She laid a hand on the warm nose of her bay mare, the animal's dark eye reflecting her like a polished stone. Morning chores were nothing to brag on, but they kept the hours stitched together. Eliza checked the latch on the barn door, pulled a strand of straw from the hinge, measured feed, and counted her cattle by the paint marks on their ears. Passing among them, she brushed her hand across each shoulder as if giving a greeting. At the smallest calf, she paused, pressing her palm over its ribcage until she felt the quick, insistent beat of its heart. It pulsed against her hand with a strength she carried away in silence. The wind rattled a loose patch of roofing, a dry clap like the pages of a book opening where no words were written. Hawks circled far out over the flats, riding the first warmth rising from the earth. Dry willow itself lay tucked beyond the cottonwoods, a steeple, a blacksmith's chimney, a line of wagon ruts baked hard enough to snap beneath a careless hand. When the coffee finished dripping, Eliza poured 2 cups, one for herself, one set across the table, steam curling just the same as if it belonged to someone. It would cool, as it always did, leaving a brown ring on the wood. She drank slowly, elbows resting on her knees, the posture of a woman who had prayed too many prayers to put words to any more. The curtain by the window stirred with the draft, its hem rising and falling like a breath. On the wall, an old nail left a faint circle where something once hung, the ghost of a presence long gone. There were days when emptiness came like the smell of distant rain, not yet fallen, but already dampening the air. It lived in small things, the scrap of cloth folded under the coffee pot, the square of sunlight that moved across the floorboards at the same hour each day, the chair pushed against the wall where no one sat. Eliza let those things be, the way one lives with a crack in old pottery. You don't pick at it, you just dust around it. By the time the sun laid a pale wash across the ridge, she walked again to the fence line. Dew still slicked the grass, carrying a chill that filled her lungs like creek water. Her hand settled on the top rail where the wood had weathered rough. Out beyond, wild horses cut across the range, their bodies flashing quick and bright against the horizon, like thoughts that come and vanish before a name can catch them. She stood there long, letting the wind press her coat close, and comb through her hair, watching the sky turn from ash to pale blue. From the corner of the barn, the little chime of tin she'd hung to mark the change of wind knocked together in a patient rhythm. Eliza leaned forward, lips brushing the splintered wood. The words came in a threadbare whisper, thinner than the thread she used to mend her clothes. "I'll give you all my cattle. Just make me a mother." The wind carried it away. No one heard but the grass and the empty sky. Still, the leaning fence post seemed to steady itself a touch, and the wooden bowl on the shelf, though empty, held the weight of a promise. When she turned back toward the house, her boots cut twin furrows in the damp dust, straight and measured. On the kitchen table, the second cup of coffee had gone cold, but its rim still held a faint fog, as if refusing to let the warmth die just yet. Eliza set the wooden bowl down once more. This time she didn't put it away. It stayed, plain and silent, waiting. Every day looked the same, until the silence itself began to speak. Morning light came slow across the dry willow valley, laying thin gold over the roofs of town and stretching shadows long across the open ground. On Eliza's place, the day rose the way it always had, quiet, steady, with no one to bear witness but cattle, fence posts, and the hills themselves. She began with coffee, same as the day before, pouring it into the chipped cup she favored. Across from her, the wooden bowl rested on the table, mute and waiting. She let it sit this time, unhidden, as though it belonged there. The steam rose in a ribbon from her cup, lifting the smell of bitter grounds into the air. Outside, her work lay scattered across the spread of land. The barn door leaned off its hinges. The corral gate sagged like an old man's shoulders. She checked the water trough, tapped the pump until a thin stream gurgled out, then bent low to sniff at it for iron and silt. The cattle shuffled in slow rhythm, tails swatting flies, hooves drumming hollow against dry soil. Each lowing voice seemed to answer some unspoken call across the prairie. Chores made a rhythm of their own. She swept the porch, not because anyone would see, but because she had always swept. She stacked kindling on the north wall, knowing a cold snap might still come. She tied back the curtain at the front window so the sun would catch the empty cradle she'd pulled closer to the light. The cradle was old, built by her father, its rockers worn smooth by hands now gone. She dusted it, though no child had ever slept there. In the corner, a pair of small shoes dangled from a nail. She brushed them clean each Saturday, same as polishing her boots, though the leather was soft and uncreased. Her eyes lingered on them longer than she meant to, then slid away, back to the tasks waiting. At noon, she carried a tin pail to the line of cottonwoods. The air was warm, filled with the droning hum of insects. She dipped from the creek, the water shallow enough to show stones streaked white where it had pulled back. On her way home, she paused, balancing the pail on her hip, listening to the wide silence. Dry Willowtown lay just beyond the ridge. Church bell, blacksmith hammer, the sound of wagons. But out here, only the wind answered. She had been into town 2 days past, stepping through the mercantile door with her list folded neat in her hand. Conversation faltered. Women steered their children aside. Men lowered their voices. She had smiled anyway, a small, tight curve of lips, and laid her list on the counter. The storekeeper's nod was curt, his ledger closed before she could ask about credit. She walked home with less than she needed, holding her head high while dust gathered on her skirt hem. Now, back on the ranch, she set her pail down on the porch and sat beside it, resting her arms on her knees. The land stretched wide in every direction, a great loneliness, broken only by the cattle moving slowly against the far fence line. A hawk circled overhead, crying sharp into the stillness. Eliza watched it, eyes narrowed, until it became a dot against the sun. Her days were shaped by habits, stitched together by small actions no one else would notice. She mended shirts with careful thread, folded them into drawers lined with lavender sachets that had long since lost their scent. She kept the ledger of cattle tallies up to date, her handwriting even and clean, though no one came to read it. Each task was its own prayer. Sweep, fold, count, mend. Without them, the silence would crush her. With them, the silence became something she could breathe. By evening, shadows stretched long across the yard. Eliza lit the lamp, its glow casting soft gold over the bare walls. She laid out 2 cups again on the table, filled them both, and sat alone with the steam curling upward. The wooden bowl remained where she had placed it in the morning, empty yet present, like a chair pulled out in readiness for someone who might never arrive. Outside, coyotes called to one another across the flats, voices sharp against the falling dark. Eliza listened, still and upright, her hands folded around the warm china. Another day had closed the same way it had opened, quiet, relentless, bound together by the habits that kept her heart from unraveling. Her greatest enemies were not men, but the unspoken walls around her. The season carried on with a kind of hard patience. By late afternoon, the sun burned white, bleaching color from the land until even the sky seemed brittle. Eliza worked through it, shoulders bent, hands steady. Nothing about her days changed on the surface, yet around her lay the weight of things unsaid, things that pressed as heavy as drought. The barriers did not shout, they did not strike. They waited in the corners of her life, shaping her in silence. A folded letter sat at the back of her dresser drawer, its edges softened from being touched, but never opened again. Her husband's last words, she supposed, though she hadn't read them. It was enough to know he had left. Sometimes she laid her palm over it before closing the drawer, as if she might gather courage through touch alone. The creek that once ran full now whispered over stone, thin and reluctant. Each morning she bent low to see how much water was left, measuring her survival in inches of flow. The cattle, restless, jostled at the trough, their eyes rolling white when the water sank too low. In town, her presence drew a different sort of drought. Words hushed when she stepped inside the mercantile. Children pulled close against their mothers' skirts. Men who once tipped their hats now studied the ground instead. She passed them with her chin lifted, but each turned shoulder settled like dust on her back. There was no law against her. No sheriff came knocking, no paper posted on her door. The judgment was softer, slower, yet no less cruel. It was a glance that lingered too long, a neighbor's wagon passing without a wave, a whispered prayer in church that carried her name like a curse. At the ranch, she bore it alone. The empty cradle stood by the window, catching the morning light. Dust gathered in the curve of its rockers. She brushed it away with the same tenderness she used on her father's old Bible, as if both deserved care, though neither answered back. Every evening, she opened the ledger, neat columns of numbers stretching across the page. She balanced them carefully, though she knew the bank would not wait forever. Notes would come due. Land and cattle might vanish as easily as breath. She recorded the figures anyway, her handwriting even, almost beautiful. In the quiet house, the scratch of pen on paper was the only proof she still had a place in this world. And yet, the deeper barrier lay inside. Not the townsfolk, not the debts, not even the husband who had walked away. It was the voice within her that asked, "What are you, if not wife, if not mother?" It asked each time she touched the little shoes hanging by the door, each time she set down the empty bowl at the table, each time she lay down alone beneath a quilt that held no other warmth. Night fell wide and star-filled. The coyotes called from the ridges. Eliza stood by the fence, hands gripping rough wood, and let the silence surround her. There was no breaking it, no arguing with it. These were her barriers, unspoken, unseen, but hard as stone. And still she breathed. The breath itself was defiance. Strangers arrived, each holding a fragment of her reflection. Late summer light slanted low across the valley, painting the grass a tired gold. Eliza rode the fence line at a walk, reins loose in her hand, her bay mare's ears twitching at every ground squirrel darting through the brush. The land was quiet in that way it sometimes was before a storm, though the sky held nothing but a pale haze. She breathed it in, the smell of dust and iron, letting the stillness settle in her bones. That was when she began noticing them, people who stepped into her days without fanfare, leaving behind something that clung long after they'd gone. The first was Jonah Pike, the blacksmith. His forge sat near the center of dry willow, hammer ringing out across the town like a heartbeat no one could ignore. He was a widower, shoulders rounded from years at the anvil, his hands cracked from heat and steel. He never spoke much to Eliza. Yet some mornings, when she rode into town, she found a parcel waiting on her porch by the time she returned. Half a loaf wrapped in cloth, sometimes a twist of jerky, sometimes nothing more than a jar of nails. No note, no words, only the weight of his thoughtfulness, plain and solid as iron. The second was a girl, skinny, dust on her cheeks, hair tangled by wind. She called herself May, though Eliza never pressed for more. Eliza found her once standing near the far fence, clutching the rails, eyes darting like a stray colt's. All the girl asked for was water. Eliza filled a tin cup and passed it through without speaking. May drank fast, water running down her chin, then fled like a shadow across the field. Yet days later, Eliza saw her again, sitting cross-legged by the trough, stroking the hide of the calf called Button. She didn't chase her off. She only stood watching until May looked up, their eyes catching for a heartbeat before the girl turned away. The third was Redbird, an older woman who moved through the land like part of it, Apache by birth, healer by trade. She came with a small bundle of herbs slung over one shoulder, trading them for milk or eggs, sometimes nothing at all. Her hair was streaked with gray, her eyes sharp as flint and soft as moss all at once. When she visited Eliza, she placed the herbs on the porch rail, accepting a jug of milk in return. She studied Eliza a moment, gaze resting on the woman's empty hands, then said only this: "The earth grows what it can, where it's tended." No judgment, just the truth, drifting like smoke between them. Each of them, in their quiet way, mirrored Eliza back to herself. Jonah's silent gifts reminded her she was not invisible. May's thin shoulders carried the same kind of abandonment Eliza knew too well. And Redbird's few words, spoken without pity, hinted at something deeper, that barrenness was not the end of a story, only a part of it. That evening, Eliza walked through her house with the lamplight low. She paused at the cradle by the window, brushing dust from its rail. Across the room, the little shoes still hung from the nail. She touched them lightly, her fingers lingering. Outside, Button bawled for his mother, and May's laughter, thin but real, floated in from the barnyard. For the first time in many months, the silence in the house felt less like a wall and more like a space waiting to be filled. It was not miracles, but small kindnesses that began to change the land. The days shortened, and the light fell earlier across Dry Willow. By late afternoon, the hills already carried long shadows, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Eliza's life held the same rhythms: cattle to check, fences to mend, the ledger to balance. But something had shifted, almost too quiet to name. May had not run off. One morning, Eliza found her curled on a pile of old sacks in the barn, knees drawn to her chest, the calf button pressed close against her for warmth. She left the girl there, said nothing, and only set an extra tin cup beside the pump. From that day on, May lingered. She helped scatter feed, fetched water, even tried her hand at patching a torn halter. Eliza began teaching her letters in the evenings, sliding the family Bible across the table, guiding her finger under each word. May stumbled, whispered, and sometimes laughed when the sounds knotted in her mouth. Eliza didn't mind. The small voice filled the house in a way no prayer had. Jonah Pike came one afternoon when the sky promised rain. The roof of the calving shed sagged in the middle, boards split from last winter's weight. He didn't ask permission, just set his hammer and nails down and started pulling rotted planks free. Eliza brought him water, watched the swing of his arm, the way he worked, slow but sure. By nightfall, the shed stood sound again. When she asked what she owed, he shook his head. The next day, she left a bundle of cattle horns by his forge, rough but useful for tool handles, knife grips, whatever he might need. No words, only trade, though the kindness lay plain between them. Redbird returned near dusk one Saturday, her bundle of herbs tied with twine. She placed it on the porch rail and stayed longer than usual, eyes sweeping the yard where May chased Button in circles. From her satchel, she drew a small pouch of seeds. "Grown where the wind rests," she said, setting it in Eliza's palm. "Plant them when the air is still." The words carried weight, though Eliza didn't ask what the seeds were. She only nodded, folding her hand around them as if they were something more than plants waiting to sprout. The land, too, began to show signs of change. Eliza opened a new ditch from the creek, letting water run into old Brennan's pasture below hers. His cattle had grown thin with the dry spell, and the look on his weathered face when he saw water trickle into his trough told her it was worth the loss to her own grass. That night, he came with a jar of honey, awkward and grateful, leaving it on her porch before fading back into the dark. Inside, the cradle by the window stayed empty, but it no longer seemed abandoned. May tucked her reading primer in it each night, neat as if laying down a child. The little shoes no longer looked like relics, but like a promise, waiting their turn. Eliza moved through these days without hurry, her steps quieter, her heart heavy still, but less brittle. Seeds had been sown, by her hands, by others, and though nothing yet had sprouted, she felt the ground beneath her feet holding more than dust. The storm broke, and in its roar she discovered what it meant to hold on. The storm did not come with thunder. It came with a sky gone the color of pewter, and a wind that smelled of iron. All afternoon the cattle shifted uneasy, bunching near the fence line, tossing their heads at shadows that weren't there. Eliza worked through it steady, tightening latches, dropping hay into the troughs, setting the lamp on the porch rail in case the light failed before its time. By evening, the clouds pressed low enough to touch the ridges. Rain began in fine needles, pattering soft at first, then thickening into sheets. The wind caught it and slung it sideways, a sharp curtain that stung the skin. Eliza pulled her coat close, lantern in one hand, her boots sinking deep into mud that hadn't existed that morning. It was May's cry that carried through the downpour. Eliza turned, lantern swinging, to see the girl at the far ditch, her small body straining against the rope looped around Button's neck. The calf, spooked by the storm, had slipped into the sucking mire at the edge of the creek, its legs thrashed, eyes rolling white. May clung to the rope, heels dug in, rain plastering her hair to her face. Eliza waded down without a word, the mud grabbing at her boots, pulling hard with each step. She wrapped her arms around the rope beside May, leaning back with all her weight. The mare, tied nearby, shied and pulled, but Eliza steadied her, looped the rope to the saddle horn, and urged the animal forward. Inch by inch, the calf heaved free, its body slick with muck, collapsing on the bank with a ragged ball. They all stood there a moment, woman, girl, and trembling calf, breathing the same wet air. May's shoulders shook, whether from cold or fear. Eliza couldn't tell. She only set a hand on the girl's back, firm and quiet, then guided her toward the cabin light, cutting through the rain. Inside, the storm beat against the walls, rattling the shutters like a thing determined to come in. Eliza stripped off their soaked coats, set them by the hearth, and stirred the fire until it spat sparks. May huddled close, Button bawling faintly outside, alive and stubborn. Later, when the girl had fallen asleep, curled beneath a blanket, Eliza stepped onto the porch. Rain sheeted across the yard, the lamp flickering under the strain of the wind. Redbird stood there, as if the storm had carried her in, her shawl dark with water. She said nothing at first, only looked at Eliza, then at the cabin where May slept. At last, she reached out and touched Eliza's midsection with a hand both light and steady. "Mothers are named by their hands," she said, voice low, almost lost in the storm. "Not always by blood." Then she turned, vanishing into the rain as if she had never been. Eliza went back inside, lit another lamp, and sat at the table. The paper of her debt note lay beneath the glass weight, edges curled from humidity. She drew it out, stared at the numbers until they blurred, then tore the sheet in two. One half she fed to the fire. The other she pressed under the weight again, letting it lie there half born, half burned. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, the cradle by the window sat in its pool of lamplight, empty still, but no longer just a vessel of loss. It seemed to hold something unseen, something waiting. Sometimes surrender is not defeat, but the soil where life takes root. The storm passed in the night, leaving the earth soaked and heavy, the air sharp with the clean smell of wet dust. Dawn came pale and hesitant, as though the sky itself were still ringing out its grief. Eliza stepped into the yard with her boots sinking half an inch at every step, the hem of her skirt already stained dark. The world seemed softer after the violence, fences glistening with beads of water, cattle steaming as they moved slow among puddles, the creek swollen and brown with runoff. She checked the herd first, her hand brushing damp hides, pausing over Button, who stood muddy but alive, nosing for his mother. May shadowed her, still barefoot, hair plastered to her head, but with a brightness in her eyes that had not been there before. The girl no longer hovered at the edges of the ranch. She walked inside it, her small hand carrying a bucket as though it had always been hers to carry. Eliza lifted her gaze to the ridge where dry willow lay hidden behind the cottonwoods. She thought of the banker, Mr. Lyle, and his ledger books. She thought of Jonah bent over his anvil, hammer ringing out against steel, and of Redbird's hand steady against her stomach. These thoughts weighed against her shoulders as she returned to the house, heavier than the wet coat she hung to dry by the hearth. On the table sat the half-torn debt note, its edges curled by fire and damp. Eliza smoothed it flat with her palm. She could not erase what was owed, but she could decide what to keep and what to give away. Before noon, she saddled the mare and drove 5 of her best heifers down the muddy track toward Jonah's forge. She left them tied in his corral with a short note wedged into the post, for the work on the shed, for the bread left at my door, for the sound of your hammer. She did not wait for thanks. At dusk, she led a pair of calves down to old Brennan's place. He came out hobbling, his hat in his hand, eyes wide at the sight of the animals. She only pointed toward the new ditch she'd opened days before, where water now ran fresh into his trough. His lips worked, but no words came. He took the rope with shaking fingers. Eliza turned away, boots squelching in the mud, leaving him standing there with the rope in his hands and tears hidden in the weathered lines of his face. Back at her ranch, she walked through the house, pausing at each object: the empty cradle, the shoes hanging from their nail, the ledger with its neat rows. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had shifted. By giving away what she had clung to most tightly, she found herself holding something greater, space enough for others to belong, space enough for herself to breathe. As night fell, she lit the lamp and poured 2 cups of coffee. May sat across from her, trying to sound out words from the book Eliza had placed before her, stumbling but laughing, her voice small and clear in the lamplight. The second cup of coffee no longer sat untouched. Outside, the storm's wreckage lay in the broken branches scattered across the yard. But within the cabin, something else had taken root. Not triumph, not wealth, but the quiet of surrender, the kind that makes room for tomorrow. Her ranch ceased to be a tomb of silence, becoming ground for voices to grow. By the time September leaned toward its close, the valley carried a different air. The hills wore a faint green again, where new shoots had pressed through the soil darkened by the storm. The ditch Eliza had cut sent a thin ribbon of water down toward Brennan's pasture, and each time she rode by, she saw his cattle lifting their heads, heavy with gratitude they could not speak. At her own place, the changes were quieter. The cradle by the window now held May's Bible primer, tucked neat inside as though it were a child itself waiting for care. The little shoes still dangled from their nail, but May had tied a ribbon between them, a careless thing that made them look less like relics and more like decorations for a festival not yet named. The wooden bowl at the table no longer stood alone. It often held bread or apples, set there as naturally as if it had always belonged. One morning, Jonah came riding up with his broad shoulders bent against the early chill. He carried a small sign he had carved from cottonwood plank. The letters were rough but clear: Dry Willow Schoolhouse. Without asking, he nailed it to the post outside Eliza's barn. May clapped her hands at the sight, then ran inside to fetch her book, calling words she could barely string together. Jonah only smiled, his eyes bright with something unspoken, before tipping his hat and returning to town. The banker, Mr. Lyle, arrived a week later, his ledger tucked under his arm, mud caking the wheels of his buggy. He had come for the debt, as was his duty. But what he found on Eliza's porch was not a woman cornered by fear. He found a table set with 2 cups, cooling in the breeze, a girl bent over her letters, and a woman whose hands rested steady on the back of a chair. She met his gaze without apology. Eliza laid the half-burned note on the table between them. "The land stands," she said simply. "You'll have your due, not in cattle, not in what feeds the soul here. I'll pledge the stony acres near the ridge, worth little, but it is mine to give." Lyle looked past her to where May's laughter spilled from the barn, where Brennan's cattle grazed fat on new grass, where Jonah's sign swung gently in the breeze. His pen scratched across the paper, altering figures, extending time. When he left, his face was softer, though he never said why. As autumn deepened, the ranch no longer felt like a solitary outpost clinging to survival. It had become something else, a place where children came to trace letters in the dust, where neighbors stopped by with jars of honey or baskets of apples, where redbirds sometimes lingered to share stories as she ground her herbs. The air itself seemed to carry more voices, more footsteps, as if the earth had agreed to cradle more than silence. At dusk, Eliza stood by the fence, watching the sky bruise purple and gold. She thought of all that had gone and of what had come in its place. Not triumph, not a miracle, but a steadying. The land was still hard. Winter would still cut deep. Yet something had changed, something like a seed, something like water after drought. She placed her hand on the worn fence rail. The wood was damp with evening dew, cool against her skin. Behind her, May's laughter carried from the cabin, joined by the low thrum of Jonah's hammer far off in town. For the first time in many years, the ranch felt less like a tomb of things lost and more like soil turned over, waiting for what might yet grow. By nightfall, she was a mother in all the ways that truly mattered. Evening fell soft over Dry Willow, not with drama, but with the hush that comes when the land exhales. The last of the light clung to the ridges, then slipped away, leaving the valley wrapped in blue. Crickets took up their patient song, and a coyote called once from the far side of the creek before silence settled again. Eliza moved through the house by lamplight. She set 2 cups of coffee on the table as she always had, but tonight one was lifted, carried in May's small hands. The girl's lips shaped halting words from the primer, her voice catching on syllables, but steady with effort. The sound filled the room in a way that left no corner empty. Outside, Button bawled softly for the night, and the cattle shifted in their pen, hooves knocking against the railings in a sleepy rhythm. Jonah's hand-carved sign hung from the post, swaying just enough to catch the lamplight from the window. Dry Willow Schoolhouse. It looked almost official, though no law had decreed it. It stood because someone had believed it should. Eliza sat back, her hands resting around the warmth of her cup. The cradle still stood by the window, and the little shoes still dangled from their nail. But they no longer spoke only of what was missing. They had become part of the room's breath, woven into the sound of May's stumbling laughter, into the scrape of chair legs on the wooden floor. When May had gone to her bed, and the house had gone quiet again, Eliza stepped onto the porch. The air smelled of sage, damp still from the last storm. She lowered herself to the top step, boots planted in the dirt, the sky wide above her. Stars pressed close, sharp and clear, the kind that made a person feel both small and seen. She thought of the words she had whispered weeks ago into the wind, that plea carried into the emptiness. "I'll give you all my cattle. Just make me a mother." Perhaps the wind had heard, perhaps not. Yet tonight, with the sound of a child breathing steady in the next room, with neighbors who had begun to step across her threshold, with water running to fields beyond her own, she felt something answer. It was not triumph, not the sudden mending of every loss. It was quieter than that. It was the steadying of a heart that had bent but not broken, the knowledge that love could take root in places barren for too long. Eliza drew her coat tighter and sipped the last of her coffee. The land lay dark and vast before her, but no longer empty. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried once, and the sound seemed less like loneliness, more like a benediction. The night carried on, And in its stillness, Eliza sat, unhurried, her heart slowed to match the breathing earth, mother, in all the ways that mattered. When all is said and done, the story of Eliza Hart isn't one of cattle or ledgers, nor even of the storms that tested her ground. It's the quiet testimony of how a soul, left for barren, can still make room for life. Out on the Western Range, where dust and silence can swallow a person whole, she learned that being a mother begins not in blood, but in the steady reach of a hand, the shelter of a roof, the gift of kindness repeated day by day. That's the kind of healing the West offers, rough-edged, wind-battered, but honest, a reminder that we are kept not by wealth, not by reputation, but by the ties we choose to weave. And maybe now, I'd like to turn to you, by the same fire of words. What do you carry that feels heavy, yet somehow keeps you alive? Share a thought if you feel moved to. It may just be the piece of trail another traveler needs to see. Until the next story, may your own road be steady, your coffee warm, and your heart reminded that even the loneliest land can bloom again.